North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today, it is a very special privilege to welcome to our program the Honorable Frank Church, the senior senator from the state of Idaho. Senator Church holds an AB and LLB degrees from Stanford University. He has a very remarkable background, including receiving the National J.C.'s Outstanding Young Man Award in 1957. He was also the keynote speaker at the 1960 Democratic National Convention. He was first elected to the United States Senate from Idaho in 1956 and was re-elected in 1962, 1968, and 1974. He presently chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is also the ranking member on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and the Senate Aging Committee. He is married to Bethine Clark, and they have two sons, Forrest and Chase. Senator Church, welcome to our program.
Nice to be back with you again.
Joining me in questioning our distinguished guest today is Bob Brown, Janelle Burke, and Roger Burr. We'll proceed to questions with Bob Brown.
Senator, your Panama Canal vote has raised a great deal of controversy in Idaho. Would you care to comment on your vote on that treaty?
Well, Bob, it was the right vote. I knew it would not be the popular vote. But in 1978, we live in an entirely different world when the treaties came before the Senate than the world that existed back in 1902 when the United States imposed its own terms on Panama. And the Panamanians have felt that they were handled unjustly, that the United States took control over what became an American colony, the Canal Zone, imposed our own laws, cut the country in two, passed the major commerce of the world through the Canal Zone, maintained what amounted to sovereign jurisdiction, though we never claimed it, in that zone, and paid the Panamanians for the privilege $250,000 a year for a tract of land that was 10 miles wide and 50 miles long. So you can see there was some basis for their complaint. And as the years passed and the world changed, their complaints became a real grievance. In 1902, a big country could do pretty much what it pleased with a small country. After all, the world was dominated by a few great colonial powers, and that was the way it was. But by 1978, we had come to live in an entirely different world. The empires were gone, the colonies had disappeared, and it was just no longer possible to maintain an American colony in a foreign land against the wishes of the people who lived in that land. That's why the treaty became necessary. In 1964, the grievance against us, degenerated into street riots in which both Americans and Panamanians were killed. 4 American presidents saw the need to write a new treaty at arm's length with the Panamanians that they would think treated them justly. And we did that, and thus avoided a condition that would have soon degenerated into a kind of guerrilla war. And the most eloquent witnesses for the treaty were the chiefs of staff and General McAuliffe, who was in charge of the American forces in Panama. General McAuliffe made it very clear to us. He said, "Gentlemen, I plead with you, give us the treaty, and we can continue then to live in peace with the Panamanians, and the canal will continue to operate. But if you refuse us the treaty, then be prepared for what will come, a kind of guerrilla war, in which I can defend the canal with 100,000 young Americans, but guerrilla wars never end, and ships of peace will not use a canal that's under siege. Remember that." He said, "We can put the Navy through it, much of the Navy, not all of it, because the canal won't carry our biggest ships, our aircraft carriers or our nuclear subs. But he said we cannot put the ships of peace through it under those conditions." So that was the first reason why it was right to do right by the people of Panama. And this treaty also takes care of American interests as you look to the future. After all, the Panama Canal is becoming obsolete. Today, over half of the maritime tonnage on the high seas is carried on ships too large to transit the canal. And under the terms of the treaty, we continue to control the canal until the end of the century. And at the end of the century, only 7% of the cargo on the high seas will be carried in ships that can still transit the canal. The canal will be obsolete. And what's our need in the future, Bob? It's not for an obsolete canal, but for the kind that can carry the commerce of the 21st century, which is a lockless sea-level canal. The only place it can be built is on the Isthmus of Panama, in a different place than the present canal, and the only way it will ever be built is with the friendship and cooperation of the Panamanian people. So you see, even though it was an unpopular vote, if you're conducting the foreign policy of this country, you've got to look ahead and try to provide for the needs of the future. And I think we have done that with this treaty, and as time passes, more and more people will see that it was the right thing to do and that it served the interests of the United States.
Janelle Burke.
Excuse me, do you feel, Senator, there was a loss of income to the taxpayers, the financial picture?
Well, that's been, you know, a much demagogued issue, but then it's to be expected that a treaty like this would become a demagogue's delight. Actually, we don't pay anything to the Panamanians. It's been said, you know, we not only gave away the canal, but we paid them to take it. All that we've done is to try to rectify a half century in which we paid them nothing, or next to nothing, by giving them a fair proportion of the tolls. We're dividing the tolls between us. We've formed a partnership. We've increased the tolls to realistic levels, and we've stopped subsidizing the foreign merchant marine. They get their money from the tolls of the canal. The only other money we're spending is to consolidate military bases. That will be about $870 million over the next 20 years. We would have spent it anyway to consolidate those bases, even if we didn't have a treaty.
Janelle Burke.
Thank you.
My question is in general about the state of the economy. In light of high interest rates, rising gasoline prices, and so forth, what steps would you propose to deal with the current inflation problem? And most specifically, what did you do with regard to the congressional pay raise? And how do you feel about the Chrysler situation?
Well, Janelle, let's see, there are 3 questions in a row. Let's start, first of all, the easiest one. I voted against the congressional pay raise, which is a position that I've taken through the years. Secondly, the Chrysler matter is a very hard one for me to decide. Normally, I would vote against any kind of rescue operation because it's been managerial incompetence that has caused the problem, the refusal of Chrysler to recognize that the world was changing and those big cars, those big gas guzzlers just weren't going to sell any longer. So I find it hard to justify using taxpayers' money now to come to the rescue of a great company that was driven into bankruptcy by the bad decisions of those who ran it. And yet I know that if that company were to close its doors, that many, many thousands of Americans would be thrown out of work. And so I am going to decide whether to vote for or against this bill on the basis of whether those who are most directly affected, both the managerial part of Chrysler and the workers and the dealers, everybody who's affected, if they're willing to pull in their belts, if they're willing to share the sacrifice, then I think in the interests of the whole economy, I may be willing to vote for the bill. If they're not, I'll vote against it. Now finally, the inflation. Janice, this is the most frustrating inflation because the principal cause of today's inflation is the spiraling cost of oil, half of which we have to import from abroad. The OPEC cartel is the world's most successful and most ruthless. It has increased the price of oil tenfold since 1974. And in this year alone, the price has gone up 60%. Now tell me, if we have to import half our oil, who's the politician who could honestly say to the people that we can maintain prices level in this country when the price of oil is jumping up 60% or more a year? It can't be done. Ultimately, the only way that we can bring stability back to the prices in our own economy is to eliminate our present dependency upon foreign oil. And of course, we're trying to do that in our energy program, but it will take time. There is no way to accomplish that this year or next year.
Roger Byrd.
Yes, I wanted to direct a question at the Iranian situation. Do you think, Senator Church, that we're taking the right steps, that is, without the use of military action? And what can we do in the future to prevent a recurrence of such a difficulty?
Roger, from the beginning, it's been clear that there was no military action that we might have taken that could have rescued these hostages. They were taken and held in our embassy in the midst of a city of 4.5 million people bristling with armament, and a city located hundreds of miles from the sea, so that they would have had advance notice of any kind of rescue operation long before it even reached Tehran. So the purpose of our restraint in the face of this extreme provocation has been to bring those hostages out safely. Some of them have come out, and we hope to have some more soon, but we won't rest contented until all of them are out. Now, we've explored every channel of peaceful intercourse with this country. It's been extremely difficult. I don't know whether we'll succeed. I have some hope that the United Nations effort through the Security Council may bear fruit. The President asked me to go to the UN and to be present at the time that we made our argument at the Security Council, because he wanted a congressional delegation there to demonstrate solidarity with the government, unity of purpose. And I think that it's important in a crisis of this kind that we do speak with one voice. As to the future, I think that if we get the hostages back safely, we can't restore relations as usual with Iran, not after a provocation of this kind. Once the hostages have been returned, then I will be willing, but only then, to hold hearings in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to consider what the nature of our relationship should be with Iran in the future, and what would be appropriate countermeasures for us to take in the light of this extreme provocation.
What do you think we should do with the Shah?
Well, you see, if we did anything with the Shah, we would be bending to the blackmail that they have attempted to impose upon us as the price for the release of the hostages. So I have felt that even though I was a critic of the policy of supporting the Shah back at the time we were doing it, that under the present circumstances, we must recognize that he was a friend and ally of the United States when he was in power, and we must leave it up to him if he wants to stay in this country or if he wants to leave. That must be his choice. If we pressure him under these circumstances, it's a signal to the rest of the world. It's the wrong signal, and I'm afraid that it would jeopardize Americans abroad in every country in the future.
For those viewers who have joined our program in progress, our guest today is the Honorable Frank Church, the senior senator from Idaho. Senator Church, another issue that's been before the people of Idaho for over 12 years is the question of wilderness and multi-use of other lands. And you have pushed through or worked with others to get a bill through the Senate recently concerning river of no return legislation, and you've testified in the House concerning that legislation. What does that do for the people of Idaho?
Wonderful things. Wonderful things. We have finally put to rest, and I believe the House of Representatives, despite the opposition of Idaho's 2 congressmen, will follow the Senate's lead. We've put to rest a controversy that has stirred up so much confusion and hysteria and bad feeling for the last dozen years, because This will finally settle the classification of these heartlands in central Idaho. It will create a splendid new wilderness, the last major addition to the wilderness system, in my judgment, in the state of Idaho. It will essentially complete that system. The wilderness itself has been well designed. It's ecologically sound. It will protect the drainage of the Middle Fork. It will provide wonderful habitat for wildlife. It's extremely important in terms of the watershed for a large part of the state. And we have designed it to maximize public use and enjoyment of the wilderness in all the years to come. Furthermore, the boundary is drawn in such a way that it will have little or no impact upon the economy of Idaho. In fact, the two lumber companies that are most closely affected have actually endorsed the bill. I don't think that's ever happened before. And as far as mining is concerned, the only known mineral in the area is the cobalt, and we've drawn the boundaries to exclude the cobalt mine and most of the cobalt belt. So I believe that we've done a good job with this, and getting this settled will work to everybody's interest.
Isn't that one of the main points, the fact that several other areas will be opened up for the lumber industry and so forth? And I believe that there's not a great deal of difference between what you and Senator McClure both have proposed in relation to settling this issue.
We were in 98% agreement. It was just two issues that we disagreed upon, which led him to vote against the bill. But nevertheless, on 98% of the area, the boundaries, the provisions of the bill, we agreed upon. And so I think that that also indicates that the work was carefully done, and that we took into full account the testimony of over 600 witnesses who appeared during the public hearings we held on this bill in the last year. I'm very pleased with the progress, and I think that when people come to understand that this bill not only creates a new wilderness, so the last major wilderness in Idaho, but also releases 900,000 acres of roadless land to be restored to the working forests, then they will see that it's a well-balanced bill.
Bob Brown.
A companion issue, of course, to the wilderness issue is the Sagebrush Rebellion that we hear a lot about. Do you feel this is an effective way to deal with the question of federal ownership of state lands, the Sagebrush Rebellion idea?
Well, the difficulty, Bob, with the Sagebrush Rebellion is that it proposes the wrong solution to the problem. I know the problem. The problem is the frustration that comes with dealing with an absentee landlord, the federal bureaucracy, which at times makes its decisions in Washington, and they're quite inappropriate for the locality. I've been helping constituents with their problems with the BLM and the Forest Service for years. I know the problem. I think there are ways to improve the management of the public lands and bring it closer to home. Ways that we're now experimenting with in the Chalice National Forest, for example, where we've set up a group that are developing a management plan which consists of the cattlemen and the sportsmen that use the land, as well as the state and the federal agencies, all working together to develop a common plan. I think that's the way we will finally deal with these frustrations that have caused the Sagebrush Rebellion. But the notion that we should transfer the title of the land from the federal government to the state government is one that we might live to regret if it ever happened. I can't see it happening. I can't see the Congress of the United States giving away an asset of such value, even if the western states were united. But if it were to happen, the state constitution requires that any of its lands must be administered in a way to maximize profit. Now, we don't run the forests that way. We run the forests in a balanced way to take care of all the public interests. If we have to run the land to maximize profit, what it really means is that the state government would become a way station on the road toward delivering these lands over into the hands of the highest bidder. And I don't want to see that happen. I've lived out in the East where there are no public lands, and I know what it's like to face the fences and the no trespassing signs, and I've seen people trying to get an outdoor experience with their campers cheek to jowl in some private campground and all their kids swimming in a crowded concrete swimming pool. I don't want that kind of life for Idaho. we ought to know that the special value of the life out here consists of the contribution that's made by the public lands and the access that all people have to those lands to enjoy them, because all the people own them.
Thank you.
Janelle Burt.
Earlier, you spoke just briefly about the energy crunch. What alternatives to the Mideast energy sources do you prefer?
Janelle, I think we have to use all alternatives. It's not a question of just choosing some. The question is whether all alternatives will be enough.
What are
in
some?
time, well, here, let me indicate what they are. First of all, solar power, that's fine. We want it. We want to use the winds and the tides. We want to use the natural hot water, and we're developing ways to do it. We want to use hydropower, and we're developing much more efficient ways to use low-head hydro, where the maximum opportunity lies. We've got to use more coal, but it's become much more difficult to expand production of coal than we ever thought it would be. For one thing, our railroads are obsolete and can't effectively carry the coal. So one problem leads to another. But we have to use all of this. We have to use nuclear energy as well. But if we're ever going to put nuclear energy to its full use, then we have to begin to solve the waste problem and solve it now. So, as the chairman of the subcommittee that deals with this whole question of alternative sources, I can say to you that we have a big program going, but it's going to take time. Converting coal to liquid fuel really isn't feasible until about the end of the century in terms of getting enough of the liquid fuel online to make any difference. The fastest thing we have to turn to, and the only alternative fuel that we do not have to develop new technology for, is gasohol. And I am the author of the gasohol bill, which has been incorporated in this new energy program. Gasohol will mean a great new market for our farmers to produce the alcohol, and if we mix it 10% with our gasoline, we can reduce our imports by fully 10% and extend our own source of supply for liquid fuels. Put it all together, it's going to take a while. But we have to proceed along all of these fronts to find the necessary sources to substitute for oil.
Roger Burt.
Yes. Do you think the publicity surrounding the issue of Russian troops in Cuba has seriously damaged the chance of passing SALT II this year or next year?
I think not, because the Senate Foreign Relations Committee adopted, by a vote of 13 to 2, a condition that I proposed, which really eliminates this issue as a block to the possible passage of the SALT II treaty. The condition is, and we have to satisfy a number of senators on this matter if we're ever going to get their votes for the treaty. The condition is that the treaty will not take effect until the President first certifies that Russian troops in Cuba are no longer engaged in a combat role, and secondly, that we will not permit any Russian military presence in Cuba, whatever form it may take, to constitute a threat to other governments in the Caribbean or elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. I believe that condition will be adopted by the Senate, and with its adoption, it will remove the combat force in Cuba as an obstacle to the ratification of the treaty itself.
Do you feel that the injection of the issue into the dialogue on Russian-American relations was a positive addition?
Well, it was, inevitable that once we discovered a combat brigade in Cuba that had been concealed from us in such a sensitive area at our very doorstep, it was inevitable that this would create a provocation. It was a provocation, and that there would be a political reaction to it in this country. Some of the self-consciously sophisticated newspapers in the East tried to make light of it, and they were very critical of me. But they missed the point. The existence of that Russian brigade doesn't constitute any threat to Miami or to the United States. Yet it is a shield for Castro And it does enable him to take a much more aggressive stance in the Caribbean, which is a seedbed for revolution. Now, how would the Russians have reacted if we had secretly deployed a Marine brigade in Finland? Would they have said, well, what's an American brigade in Finland? Anyway, they're not going to seize Leningrad. I think that my reaction to it is one that most people in Idaho shared. The Russians have no business deploying combat troops in Cuba at the doorstep of this country.
Senator Church, you as ranking member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee is a very, very important position in relation to an issue in Idaho that concerns us, and that's our water and whether it might go to the Southwest or not. Could you give us the present status or the protections that you are attempting to provide in relation to federal legislation about diverting water to the Southwest?
Well, it's always been, you know, number one on my agenda of things to do for Idaho, and my job to see to it that Idaho water does not get diverted into Los Angeles. The problems in Los Angeles have been self-created. The basic problem is too many people and too little water. So they have often looked toward the Northwest very covetously. We have countered the threat with a moratorium which was first passed in 1968. Senator Len Jordan and I worked hard on it, which not only prohibits any interbasin transfer of water, but even prohibits any studies on interbasin transfers of water. And last year, I was able to get that moratorium extended for another 10 years to give the Northwest a chance to develop its own resources. We'll have need for all of our water. That's clear.
Thank you very much. And with that, we must bring our program to conclusion. On behalf of our staff, I express our deep appreciation.
Thank you. It's been very nice to be with you again. I appreciate your questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been the Honorable Frank Church, the senior senator from the state of Idaho, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's been our pleasure to have him on the program. May I take this opportunity to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, when again we'll be conducting an interview. Have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.